Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the Council, and on behalf of the board and the members, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Our topic is a discussion of U.S. policy with regard to cyberspace, and we have an extraordinary panel of individuals assembled to do just that. We want to thank the Computer Sciences Corporation for their support of this program tonight. We are most fortunate to have, as our moderator, the Honorable Franklin D. Kramer, who is a former chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and a member of our executive committee. Mr. Kramer is a national security and international affairs expert who is very familiar with issues of cybersecurity. He is the principal editor and author of several chapters of the book Cyber Power and National Security that was published about a year ago. He has served in government as a senior appointee in 2 administrations, including Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs for President Clinton. He is Vice Chairman of the Atlantic Council Board of Directors and a capstone professor at the Elliott School at George Washington University. Please join me in welcoming Frank Kramer and our distinguished panel.
Thanks very much, Heidi, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be here. This is one of the most important issues, I think, that faces the United States and the world in terms of international security. And the people we have here to discuss it, Sam Visner and Bob Butler, are 2 of the world's leading experts. If I could frame the issue first and then turn it over to them, cyber really has 2 parts. One is the use part, if you will. It's the flat world that Tom Friedman talks about. It's just-in-time logistics. It's the internet to cause orange and other color revolutions. It's all that expansion that allows us to do many of the things that we never could do before. But the other side of cyber is that in order to do those very positive things, economics, ideology, democracy, even security, you have to trust it. You have to believe that it's reliable. You have to be sure that it's there when you need it. And you have to be sure that it'll be able to do what you need it to do. And that trust and that reliability is really in question these days. There are many, many stories in the newspapers, not least of which within this past week we saw a story that said that the United States military's unarmed aerial vehicles were subject to a virus. Didn't say what was going to happen, but it's enough to make you think. And you've heard the Deputy Secretary of Defense, with whom Bob worked very closely, for example, talk about the concerns that he had. And the phrase that the Pentagon's cyber systems are probed 6 million times a day should not be taken lightly. 6 million probes is not the same as 6 million intrusions, but it does let you know that somebody's thinking about it. So these are issues that we have to think about, but certainly not only from a military point of view, but from an economic point of view. The critical infrastructure, the electric grid, the financial part of what we do, transactions and the like, air transportation, for example, water, all of these are now run very much by cyber and very much by the internet. Regular financial transactions. I'm a great fan of Amazon, among others. I suspect other people could raise their hand likewise. How do you do ordinary transactions? So much subject to it, online banking and the like. So these are all issues that we really need to think about, and each of our panelists here are extraordinarily expert in this arena. Bob, with whom I've worked closely, Bob Butler, is a retired Air Force colonel. He's worked in the private sector as well as, again, for the government. When he left, if I remember correctly, he actually worked for CSC, as I recall. Left there, went back into the government, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber, and just recently left within about within the last month or so. Sam Visner, also very long, distinguished governmental career in what's broadly called the intelligence community. Very, very knowledgeable about all these issues, now does work for CSC, and he's the Senior Vice President in charge of cybersecurity, among many other things. And his company works a full spectrum. So they do things, if you will, for the military, but they also do things in many of the civilian areas. I'll let Sam describe that. But the importance of being able to work in what companies sometimes call different verticals. What do you need to do in the healthcare arena, for example? What do you need to do in the electric grid arena? What do you need to do for the military? All different kinds of things, and it raises a variety of different kinds of issues. What kind of risks you want to take? What kind of resources do you want to apply? How good does good enough have to be to make you sure that you have the adequate kind of cybersecurity that you would need? So with that, let me turn it over, and why don't we just go alphabetically, if that's all right. Bob said that he would talk about 12 plus 12, that is to say the last 12 years and the next 12 years.
Right.
And I want you to hold them. I want you to write down the next 12 years and then, catch him up a year from now and see how he's doing. And then Sam will talk about the issues of, if you will, cyber as a borderless concept and what happens to the concept of sovereignty. And are countries in charge of this? Are private companies in charge of this? Is no one in charge of this? And how do we handle it? So, and then we'll be open for a discussion throughout. So with that, Bob.
Great. Thanks, Frank. It has been a couple of months since I've left the Pentagon, actually exactly 2 months today, that I departed the job as working cyber policy with Bill Lynn and others. Actually, it was kind of deja vu. I was over in the Pentagon earlier today for Bill Lynn's farewell ceremony as he gets ready to transition now as well. What I'd like to do is not go back 12 years, but I'll go back about 12 to 18 months and kind of talk a little bit about what I see in terms of the dynamic between what we're doing from a policy and strategy, technology perspective, vis-a-vis our challenges in security. And just to get to the bottom line up front, my sense is we've made good progress, but it's certainly not enough. Certainly not enough. And I'll kind of talk through it just based on seasons. It was about 18 months ago that we stood up Cyber Command within the Department of Defense. And I think we did it for all the right reasons. We were challenged in many different ways with organization as well as doctrine, getting our arms around what we now call cyberspace as an operational domain. So that was May of 2010. As we moved through the summer months, we also worked together with Bill Lynn. We penned an article that I think many of you read in Foreign Affairs. That really addressed a threat issue that was, at that time, a watershed event. And I mean at that time, 2008, 2009, Buckshot Yankee was a watershed event. But we know in the same month, August of 2010, when we went ahead and published the Foreign Affairs article, Stuxnet was right in front of us. And so what we began to see, I think, in that time frame is as we work in the realm of cyber, we are working to try to correct past deficiencies, but we have to keep our eye not only in the here and now space, but look forward. In the time since then, I believe we've seen that happen over and over again. In the fall of 2010, we started to work both with the White House on a legislative agenda dealing with information sharing. We knew that was important, just as WikiLeaks broke, right? And so we went from a kind of a strategic issue into a very tactical mentality. What could we do to address a problem, not just a Bradley Manning problem, right? It was an issue of why didn't we see this ahead of time? Why didn't we understand what was needed in terms of things like role-based access on the technology side? But this whole idea of finding the right balance between the need to share and the need to secure, right? As we kind of went through the rest of the year, we began to see and continue to see both in intelligence estimates as well as in capabilities being deployed challenges. And again, we were making progress. I think we are still making good progress. But as we turned the corner and we began to get ready to publish a defense cyber strategy, as we got ready to publish an international cyber strategy from the White House, where we had our first declaratory policy statements, as we got ready to look at trusted identities As a strategy, what happens? We have a whole rash of intrusions that basically really threw us into a relook at a lot of what we were trying to accomplish, right? The whole idea of trusted identities was challenged with the RSA intrusion, with two-factor authentication. That's not only a technology issue, that's a strategy and policy issue that we had to work our way through. And there were a rash of activities that continued to evolve. And so my sense is, as we went forward in time, and as we continue to go forward in time, and a challenge for this audience and for others concerned about national security, is we need to find ways to continue to not only close the gap, but to understand that networks will be continuously breached. We need methods for doing continuous innovation in policy and technology, and we need to have our eyes on the ball with continuous risk mitigation. It's not one insider threat scenario. It's a variety of things that we haven't even imagined, especially with the technology that's advancing upon us. So from my perspective, now being 2 months out, working a little bit with the private sector, I want to get on with it. I want to implement faster on scale. And so for me, it's the idea of advancing capabilities as it relates to what we wrote about in the defense cyber strategy as well as in the international cyber strategy. What do I mean by that? We need to get on with international norms. Okay, these are hard issues, right? But you build coalitions of the willing, you take elements of ideas that you know have merit, and you begin to work those coalitions of the willing. We did that with NATO. Frank's aware of this. We did this with NATO over the last year as we began to build towards the summit. And we are finally moving with NATO in some really advancement of capability as they try to protect their networks. We need to do the same thing with IP theft and norms as an example of an element of policy, cyber policy, that needs to move forward. We need to take private-public sector models and not just talk about them, but do them, right? And so in the Defense Department, working with the Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence, we've been very successful, I think, with models like the Enduring Security Framework, working advancements in the realm of trying to promote greater information sharing, sharing of threat information and threat mitigation techniques within the defense industrial base. We need to begin to scale those. And it's not just private to public, it's public to public and private to private. Those models, as we look at the internet and where we're going, we look at where we need to grow capability, become hugely important. Within the international cyber policy realm, to me, there needs to be an advancement beyond where we are with the declaratory policy positions, right? And so this strategy lays out quite a few different policy priorities. We need to work together. And when I say we need to work together, it's not just a White House lead or a State Department lead or a Department of Justice or a Department of Defense lead. We need to come together as a community here in Washington and outside of Washington on implementation strategy. Within the Department of Defense, as we left, we do have an implementation strategy. For every priority listed within the DoD, what we put in the shorthand Cyber 3.0 strategy, we have an implementation piece that we're working. Challenging in this, economically driven world where we're looking to draw down budgets, but at the same time, it really comes down to smart calculus and looking at divestiture and reinvesting in important areas that we know will help us advance as a nation. One last element before I turn it over to Sam. Based on my background as an intelligence officer as well as working in information technology, I can't underestimate the importance of changes that need to continue to occur on leading edge in the technology realm, but also in the intelligence realm. As the Director of Intelligence at Transportation Command during OEF and OIF, I was low man on the totem pole in terms of collection and analytical priorities. I had to think of new ways to help us move troops, guns, and butter with velocity and with protection. To do that required a different way of looking at merging and meshing business intelligence with classical intelligence, traditional intelligence. New ways of taking information from shipmasters and security officers and bringing them into the mix. We need to do more of that on the collection side. We need to find ways to take McAfee's reporting and semantics reporting, and not only their intrusion reporting, but their mindset, and beginning to integrate that with what we're doing within the United States government. We're starting to do that in elements like supply chain, but we need to go a whole lot further. We need to do it on scale. In the area of analysis, just as if you go back in time and you looked at what we had estimated back in 2009 or 2008 of what would occur over the next few years, there was no anticipation of Stuxnet. There was no anticipation, really, in terms of time parameters with a WikiLeaks. We continue to be challenged in terms of intelligence estimates, and that's not a slam against anyone in the intelligence community. It's just hard, right? And we need to do better. And so challenging the assumptions in the intelligence world become critically important, and then working to ensure that collectively we put the right kind of collection stream against the newest set of assumptions to help us continually innovate, continually mitigate risk. I couldn't agree more with Frank in terms of the emphasis as we look across the 5 pillars within the Defense Department strategy. We look at these priorities in the White House's international strategy. It's not only about DoD, it really is about what I would call 4 other I's. It's internal to the department, certainly, but it's interagency, it's international, and it's definitely with industry. We have to work together. As a group of national security strategists and experts, but more importantly as people that see this threat continuing to grow on an escalatory rate to begin to counter a threat that we're struggling with in terms of anticipating scale and points of injection. With that, I'll turn it over to Sam.
Thanks. Thank you, Bob. I'm grateful to the World Affairs Council for the opportunity to join you all and also join my friend Bob Butler. Bob and I have worked together both in the private sector and Bob in the public sector while I've been trying to fashion a strategy for my company. And I'm honored to share any platform with Frank Kramer, who is a great teacher in this area. I have a set of comments, and I'll try to get through them, but it's always a little difficult to talk about cyber and cybersecurity because it's a very broad topic, and it's sometimes difficult to know what is the specific areas of interest that an audience has and where we can engage most productively in the discussion. So assuming we've done this right and we leave some time for question and answer, I think Bob, Frank, and I will have the opportunity to judge the areas of interest that you hold most closely, and we'll try to get through them. And even before I get into the comments I was prepared to make, I'm going to echo some comments that I made earlier today in another meeting, and that is I think that in the cyber area, information is not as good as it needs to be. And as a friend of mine would say, we need to remember that the plural of anecdote is not evidence. So we hear a lot of numbers cast around here, and these numbers relate to where we think things are coming from and how bad the damage is and how many intrusions are taking place and whether or not those intrusions are causing cyber crime or some other kind of an activity. And all I can tell you is I've heard numbers relating to the same problem that are not even within an order of magnitude similar. So it seems to me that as we get into this business, we ought to stop with some of the hyperbolic language and start getting down to brass tacks and do a better job of collecting information, analyzing it, and using it to help policymakers and decision makers do a better job in meeting their responsibilities. One could ask about the private sector stakes in cybersecurity, and since I've now moved into the private sector, and I've been there now again for quite a few years, and its intersection with foreign policy. And some of these stakes are obvious, and even though both the public and the commercial sectors and the private sector do share stakes, it's also true that their perspectives on these stakes are different. From the public sector's perspective, it's about national security, it's about national survival, it's about the sovereign prerogatives of a country, of a government. If for the private sector, it's about the information's value to the company and to its shareholders and to its customers and the effects of good or bad cybersecurity on that value. And those are both legitimate perspectives. But it's also true that the stakes tend to be common. Just about every aspect of business today, from retail commerce to managing critical infrastructures, from banking to pharmaceuticals, it all relies on cyberspace. In my own company, we're an IT company, and our work ranges across all of those verticals. And I have responsibilities for trying to do a competent job of cybersecurity in financial services, healthcare, chemicals, energy, natural resources, tech and consumer, manufacturing, aerospace, and defense. And all of these industries or verticals, as Frank put it, depend on information technology and they depend on cyberspace. And for them, their stakes are high and certainly going up. And we're all at risk. From Sony and Lockheed to PBS and NASDAQ, from banks to national laboratories, we've all witnessed the ravages of cyber exploitation and cyber attack. One of the discussions I heard earlier today is what's going to happen when we move into the Internet of Things. And the Internet, today, the Internet essentially connects us as human beings, and it connects us with systems that allow us to engage in transactions. But in the Internet of Things, things such as your refrigerator, things such as your pacemaker will have Internet protocol addresses, and they will communicate via the network. And the Internet of Things is going to be extended into things like the payloads on board UAVs and the UAVs themselves and the artillery rounds that we use to target things as well. You should know that, that there are requests for information out. How do we extend these technologies all the way out to things, to going beyond the things that we use all the way to the things themselves? So we're going to have to figure that out. Cyberspace is really borderless, and I know that sounds like kind of a chestnut, but it really is a place where distinctions are less evident all the time, every day. The Internet traverses national borders, and there really are no borders in the Internet. One could discuss whether or not any particular company operates in any particular country today. But if you take a look at cloud service providers like Amazon and Google, where are their server farms? They're in many different places. The data, the applications are spread everywhere. There really are no national borders, and this is true for supply chains. So whatever legal regime governs our operations in cyberspace is not going to be constrained by national borders. And we do need, I would say, a new international legal framework if we're going to think about both internal law enforcement and external global cyber governance. The concept of national ownership of the global information technology infrastructure is also less meaningful every day. And that's only one aspect of what I mean by borderless. In cyberspace, there are no borders between public and private systems. The systems that serve our critical infrastructures depend on interconnected information systems. And the days in which information systems that manage critical infrastructure like power and water, where those were isolated from the larger environment, that's history, that's gone. Today, more and more of these systems are going to have Internet protocol or IP addresses. They're going to be hooked up to the Internet or Internet-like architectures. They're going to be as defensible or lack the same defensible features as the Internet. And we've learned from Stuxnet that systems that used to be air-gapped, that were not connected, today are. And whether or not, and regardless of how that border was breached, the border between the Internet and an industrial control system that we didn't think was hooked to the Internet, somebody got over that border. Somehow that happened, and it's going to happen in the future. There's no way around it. Borderless nature of cyberspace has other implications. Critical intellectual property, and I'm not just talking about national security information or classified information, but the competitively important information on which our economic security depends, it's also at risk from an enemy and enemies able to breach today's porous defenses. And we have to get used to the fact that perfect security is not going to be possible. The advantage does, as Bob said, lie with the attacker. You know, we have big attack surfaces to defend. An attacker needs to find a hole. So today we need to go to a mechanism by which we can operate confidently in cyberspace, understanding that there will be risks, there will be problems, and the analogy I use is like a car. I can't guarantee you won't have an accident. We'll try to improve the chances that you won't, reduce the likelihood that you will, make the accident less severe, ensure that you're not hurt, give you a loaner car while your car's being fixed, which is another way of talking about resiliency, and get your car fixed. But where nobody's going to be able to guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen. What we want is to increase our level of assurance and confidence that we can operate well. And this is something a challenge we're going to have to meet in this borderless world. And this brings to mind another border that's been breached, which is the border between what nation states do and what individuals do. And unlike warfare conducted by armies, navies, and air forces, cyber warfare has very low barriers to entry. It's pretty easy to get into the game. And as a result, non-state actors, cyber criminals, hacker groups, and what we call cyber patriots, aligned in some cases with nation-state governments, they seem to possess sophisticated infrastructures for cyber exploitation, which is the ability to steal information and compromise it, and cyber attack, the ability to degrade information or even damage the infrastructure that depends on information. Let me interject, by the way, an example here of what another nation, the United Kingdom, has done. And I commend this example to our own policymakers. Her Majesty's government has recognized explicitly the need to safeguard business information, and they didn't call it national security information. They released a document a few years ago entitled Digital Britain. And it says that, in their view, UK companies with good cybersecurity get competitive advantage. It's good for their companies, and it's good for the UK, and therefore the UK has a public interest in the cybersecurity of the private sector in the UK. Sounds pretty simple, but it's a pretty sophisticated idea. Back to borders. Whereas citizens were protected in their private lives from military-grade weapons, more or less, today in cyberspace that's not true. I don't expect to see a T-80 tank drive up to my house, and if I do, I'm really going to be very worried about that. But when nation states and non-state actors share capabilities and maybe even resources and infrastructure in cyberspace, it's difficult to make a meaningful distinction between threats to our government, threats to our industries, threats to our infrastructure, and threats to ourselves. And as a result, we've had to learn to protect ourselves at home, in our offices, in our factories, in our universities, in our nonprofits, at the World Affairs Council, and in the Pentagon, all alike as a government and companies from weapons-grade threats. It is very much as if someone's driven a tank up to your house or up to your office. One more border to consider. In the recent past, many thought that only national security information was at risk, but that commercial information was not. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had people say, well, look, you're a former government guy, you think about cybersecurity from a national security perspective, but we're just a company. You know, nobody's after our information. Nobody's after information that we've got. Or if they are, they're not going to be using the same kind of tools that a foreign government would use. Well, interesting idea, but that's just not the way it is now. National power is increasingly a function of economic power, and that economic power depends on proprietary commercial information relating to product designs, go-to-market strategies. So commercial information, bus designs, and I'm using an example of a German bus company that had their design purloined and found that market access to them was denied in the fastest growing market for their product in the world. It's a devastating gut shot of a problem to have. But factory designs, all of these things are at risk. And the example that we use, I didn't bring it, but you can take a look at a picture of the bus this company designed and the knockoff that somebody else is selling. You'd have to work pretty hard to see the difference. And unfortunately, so did their customers and so did their stakeholders, and they lost their market. There are some interesting opportunities in cyberspace. And I'm going to offer one of them, and this is one that I've been, as an adjunct at Georgetown, asked my students to look at. In the early 1990s, anthropologist Arturo Escobar challenged his colleagues to consider and to start theorizing on the effects of a global information infrastructure on cultures, societies, and behaviors. He urged other academics and researchers to start to generate hypotheses in these areas, and today's social networking companies were not even in view. He'd never heard of Facebook and Twitter and Baidu and these other things when he came up with this idea. Today, our portal to cyberspace is broad, and it's everywhere. It's on your pocket, it's in your car, it's at your house, it's everywhere you intend to be. So we're now seeing the effects that cyberspace can have on behavior, on national movements, and on those opposing nation-state governments. We've seen in the Arab Spring, and we're starting to see in other places now, how this aspect of cyberspace can change the balance of power between sovereign governments and the people who resist these governments. And a thought that Frank, you introduced to the conversation, and hopefully we will be able to discuss, and I've been discussing with my students, is whether or not the sovereign prerogatives that governments used to enjoy, that some of those prerogatives are slipping away and are slipping into the hands of non-state actors and individuals who can now employ some of those prerogatives, the prerogatives of a monopoly of information technology and information, how they're going to use it. And this is really important. Cyberspace, in this instance, is not just a reflection of what happens in the physical world. It's not just communication. Instead, cyberspace is its own environment. It makes its own phenomena possible. And in response to the question that some people are asking, is cyber its own domain? Yes, it is its own domain. Given the importance of social media to movements that we generally support in the United States, for example, in Egypt and elsewhere, do we have the responsibility to strengthen the cybersecurity of those systems on which social media depend? I would argue that we do. There are going to be a range of views on this. But cyberspace is not just a place where you report on things. It's actually may have made some of these things possible. So at the same time, we're trying to make sure that we can secure cyberspace, but we also want it to be open and accessible because it's an instrument of soft power. It's a two-edged sword. Those of us in industry, like our government friends, are being rocked back on our heels by these phenomena. We depend on a stable, fairly well-regulated international environment for commerce, and today our commerce is transnational. We wonder what legal remedies are available when our information is stolen or our systems are damaged. The national legal authorities, are they empowered to help us? In China, non-Chinese companies are compelled to adhere to Chinese law and policy, including policy regarding privacy. And I'm not giving you a value judgment here. It's just a fact that in a particular country, you have to adhere to that country's laws. When Google encountered an environment in which the privacy of its customers' search and email information appeared to have been compromised, it appealed to other firms working in China to help it gain traction in an effort to restore privacy. Failing to get their support, it left the Chinese market, a move that stimulated the U.S. Secretary of State to make public the need for a global policy of respect for information in cyberspace. And with due respect, that was perhaps one of the first real U.S. policy statements about cybersecurity, and it predated by a year or two the DoD policy, which is more complete, but it presaged it. Industry needs a predictable global business environment, and we need to do our share in creating that environment. At the same time, government is facing a conundrum. Can cybersecurity standards be legislated? And boy, do I get this all the time. If you can paper your living room, and a good large living room at that, with all of the draft legislation that's out there right now. Can industry be trusted to do its part? Should cybersecurity be mandatory? Are incentives the right way to proceed, or can we punish companies into getting this right? You can imagine my view. Given that the public and private sectors are threatened by the same onslaught, what can we do to share sensitive threat information? And this last point is a really big problem, and a number of us are working on it. There is a program, the Defense Industrial Base Pilot Program, that the Pentagon manages, and it is trying to bring together companies, including mine, to share information about the threat and how to mitigate that threat. In my view, this is the right way to go. It represents a good deal of promise because it unites interests, it unites information, it unites best practices, and builds a professional community of practice across all sectors, public and private. Can we get this model extended to our allies, to our trading partners? I think we ought to consider how do we do it. Lastly, and this is sort of the last of my prepared comments, do we have a conception of our national interest in cyberspace? If we do, are we developing a policy architecture of policymakers, policies, assigned responsibilities, and resources and programs to support that interest? And in today's constrained budget environment, coming up with programs that actually support those policies and that interest is going to be very hard. So we're going to have to get that right.
As Sam mentioned, the barriers to entry are very low. It is an offense-dominant world. And what we don't have in place is across the board in cyberspace, which, and I agree with Sam's comments about the challenges with the borders, we don't have a way of actually doing uniform policing of what's going on inside of the networks and by actors that may have malicious intent against U.S. either public or private sector interests. So the state actors are very engaged with building capability, and then you have them using capability not only in terms of the methods I talked about, but actually in some cases using those capabilities to handle domestic problems, shutting down internet access within their countries, using that as a propaganda technique in new and different ways. It creates a real challenge just in terms of looking at it from say, a national security perspective of how you begin to counter those kinds of state actor threats. On the non-state side, a lot of focus over the years looking at the advancement of Al-Qaeda and terrorist organizations. They are becoming more sophisticated with their use of the internet. That is one group based on their intent that certainly from the Department of Defense and others within the national security community are very concerned about. With regards to other non-state actors, we talk about not just hacktivists, but people that are involved with, again, ill intent towards U.S. or allied interests and what they can do. It is that we see within that manifested in small group activities that are growing larger. Anonymous LUSEC, or any of these groups that basically rally around a cause, and there's some cases a prize, some cases just a goal that is placed out there that create challenges for us, and they intersect with national interests that state actors and businesses need to be concerned about. Finally, the criminal activity. What we've seen is an incredible growth in criminal activity, underground criminal activity on the internet, which is really a big concern. And then when you begin to see the kinds of movement between those business syndicates on the internet with state actors, it really becomes very, very troublesome. Bill Lynn used to talk about, as we traveled, about the accidental release of toxic malware, that could come through maybe a nation state with poor operational security back out to a criminal group or to a group that has, again, different interests that are not aligned with us, and the impact that could have.
I'm more concerned about state actors than I am about non-state actors, and here are the reasons. Attribution is very difficult in cyberspace, knowing where the attack came from. But if we can figure it out and it's a criminal, then we can try to do good detective work, to arrest them, to prosecute them, and put them in prison. And if they're overseas and it's a country with which we have some kind of a legal framework or understanding in place, we might do the same thing. But in the case of a state actor, we don't have an international understanding. We don't have an international architecture of global governance that controls and constrains bad actors and sets rules of the road for good actors. And some of the frameworks that we've seen are frameworks, frankly, in my view, that may actually protect some bad actors from internal interference, but actually do nothing to constrain bad action on the part of some nation state governments. The other reason is that I think that when you're looking at cyber and you think of it as an existential threat, then you have the question of deterrence to worry about. And deterrence is an issue for nation states, not really non-state actors. In nuclear warfare, you think about deterrence as, I know where the attack came from, I can threaten massive retaliation, and therefore we have some means of deterring an actor. If in cyberspace you don't know where the attack came from, how are you going to threaten massive retaliation if you can't do attribution? I think that's a real problem, and that's another reason why I'm more worried about the state actor issue. And I'll give you yet another reason. I don't think it's, when countries engage in some kind of cyber combat, they use cyber arms, they engage in computer network attack. The question has to be asked, what are they doing and why are they doing it? In 2009, there was a distributed denial of service attack against, it appears to have been U.S. forces in South Korea. And people attribute this to the North Koreans. Whether or not that's true, let's ask ourselves hypothetically, if it was North Korea, why did they engage in a distributed denial of service attack against South Korea and U.S. forces in South Korea? It wasn't for their own amusement. My view is it might have been a test of their ability to conduct cyber operations as part of broader military operations. If they were to move against the South, they would do a number of things. There would be conventional weapons, they might threaten to use nuclear weapons, and they might try to cut off American forces in South Korea and keep them from coordinating with their South Korean allies using a distributed denial of service attack. So the question is, when another country engages in this activity, is it part of a larger integrated concept of operations? And if so, do we understand that concept of operations and what lies behind it? A couple of other really tough problems that I really worry about. I think when you get back to this Internet of Things, to the connection of the Internet or to the global information infrastructure, to industrial control systems, embedded systems inside of factories and hospitals, or SCADA systems, supervisory control and data acquisition systems that coordinate the power grid. Those systems were not designed for this kind of interconnection, so people didn't worry about the security of interconnection that arises. So we need to think that through before we move too quickly in that direction. I think there's a lot of promise to that kind of technology, but I think we ought to consider the risks. And the other area about which I worry is mobile computing. Mobile computing, which is taking over for the desktop, and more people are buying mobile devices, tablets, iPads, or smartphones, iPhones, Blackberries, and other devices. These devices were designed for their portability, for their efficiency, for their usability, for their convenience. Were they designed for their security? So one of the questions I would ask is, as these devices overwhelm our use of more traditional desktop devices, do we have a concept of operations? Are we updating the virus software in our smartphone as regularly and religiously as we do on our desktop machines? I would suspect many are not. So I think that there's a whole set of technologies, a whole set of practices, and a whole set of processes that haven't migrated to industrial control systems, to SCADA systems, and to mobile computing. So that's another hard problem that I think is in front of us right now.
It is about IP theft and the idea of building knockoff products and companies in other places. It's also about counterfeit hardware, which could be used in different ways to affect us in both from an economic and national security perspective. It is truly about an intersection between national policies and economic policies as we look at foreign-based MNCs, multinational corporations that are involved with predatory practices. And it goes back to the, how do we work things from an international perspective here? How do you begin to take policies that traditionally have been in the domain of USTR and the ECO folks and begin to marry them up with national security? And the last is really driving towards the future, and that is this whole battle that a lot of folks don't talk about right now, but we have a heated discussion going on standards, right? The internet works based on standards and standards implementation. Based on where the internet is today and how it has evolved, we're running out of addressing space, we're running out of robustness to handle the amount of information. Data creation is estimated, and it's probably a wrong projection, at 60% a year over and over again. It's very hard to get our arms not only around where we're going in terms of technology expansion and information, but within this realm, we have lots of players that are not naturally aligned with U.S. and allied interests, as well as U.S. business concerns, suggesting standards and making progress in the standards discussion, which could actually create a lot of problems down the road in terms of military readiness, national security readiness in the future.
I actually do think that some standards in terms of cybersecurity are a good idea. And the standards relate to, are you using good information and are you using what are considered to be generally accepted practices? But those standards can't relate to, did you make your system invulnerable? Because trying to make those systems invulnerable is like asking whether or not somebody has the capacity to boil the ocean. It's not possible to do that. What you can do is you can say that you are using good information, you are employing good technology, that you have engaged yourself and your people in a good professional community, and that professional community has a good understanding of the best practices as they're understood today, and you are operating your business competently and responsibly, which, by the way, is the standard to which most companies, particularly public companies, are supposed to be operating today. So I think standards that are crafted at that level of assurance and confidence, as opposed to some pretended level of perfection, is correct. How to get to those standards, and in terms of the technical standards, I'll leave that for some technologists to address. There are two competing schools of thought, and there are some variations between them. But if you go to Capitol Hill, you'll hear, I think, two competing schools of thought. And one school of thought says the private sector cannot be trusted to adhere to these standards because they are expensive and they are focused only on cost. And if these standards raise cost, we can't assure ourselves that the private sector will get this work done, and therefore we need some punitive measures. I don't necessarily agree with that point of view. If, for one thing, if I feel that my business cannot operate continuously, that my business can't deliver to its customers, that it can't meet its responsibilities and it can't perform economically, I have a responsibility to myself, and I also have a good self-interest in getting this right. So there is another point of view that says good information sharing, possibly some incentives, and certainly some protections if there is a breach for good breach reporting. And I think there remains today some fear, particularly in the financial services sector, about doing breach reporting. Some level of immunization there, which would allow those people who are doing an honest job of detecting the problem, reporting the problem, and seeking help for the problem. That, I think, is absolutely correct. What about international standards? And I'm going to give you what I think is maybe my naive point of view. That goes to the question of international governance. At some point, I think international governance is likely to emerge. Will it emerge in an environment in which U.S. interests are protected, are respected, are cared for deliberately? Or if we don't engage in terms of the development of an international governance strategy, it will emerge, but our interests will only be protected serendipitously. If somebody else happens to share those interests, they might do something that is good for our own point of view. But if you believe, and I think it's possible to believe, that over time some kind of an international governance approach will begin to emerge, we have two choices. Let it emerge without our influence and hope for the best. Hope isn't a very good plan. Or hope that it emerges with our influence and do a competent and honest job of making sure that influence reflects our values and reflects our point of view. And I'm going to add one point here. There is a discussion underway, and Frank is probably familiar with it, and possibly Bob, as to whether or not the open nature of the internet reflected a series of deliberate policy decisions or simply reflects our values. And one point of view says we crafted the internet to be open because we anticipated a world in which an open internet would serve our values and therefore serve the interests of U.S. soft power. There are others who would say, well, it wasn't deliberate, but it's kind of, as somebody said, the kind of people we are. But whatever happens, we have made decisions which have resulted in the information environment we've got today. So it seems to me that we ought to start taking charge of the decision-making process and start to shape it before somebody shapes it for us.
We're still living in a world where, in many ways, we deal with these issues either event by event. We build delegation guidance to go to a particular international event. We come out of that event, we do a hot wash, and that's it, right? We need to build strategies and measure the effectiveness of strategies over time. We need to do that with the private sector. Other nations, I am finding and watching how their technologists are linked to their political apparatus. We need to tighten up ours as we move forward to help understand the implications. When I say BGP, to a lot of people, they don't know what that is. Border Gateway Protocol. Why is that important? Border Gateway Protocol is one of the key standards for defining the interfaces of how we move across, yes, a borderless, but it is a boundary within the networks that is governed by different authorities. And if we don't have something like that type of Border Gate Protocol working properly around the world, it is going to potentially jeopardize military readiness. We may not be able to do what we're doing in Afghanistan or Iraq. That's a problem. So we've got to create some education mechanisms. We've got to create some ways of connecting people that normally are not connected together with regards to technology and policy making. And I think, again, I go back to the idea of coalitions of the willing beginning to grow on scale as a very effective way of moving forward.
Does the United States continue to have the strength to make the next set of advances, or are we seeing other countries with capabilities that are more likely to make that next set? How do you evaluate our overall positions, strengths, and weaknesses?
I remain convinced that we do have those strengths as a country, and that we have those strengths to an extent that other countries do not necessarily share. We have a lot of bright people. We have excellent academic institutions. We have a tradition of innovation. But we also have something that I think is particularly special, and that is a set of values and a way of operating in this country, which is a kind of intellectual and social entrepreneurship. And I'm not talking about business entrepreneurship. I'm talking about the willingness to try new ideas, to communicate, to collaborate, to test those ideas with our peers, to do so in a way that is small d democratic. And as a result, I think among the next advances will be new phenomena that will emerge in cyberspace, with cyberspace as a domain, coming out of things like changes to culture, changes to society, changes to behavior and to belief. Many of these things can be good things, particularly if they come out of that kind of democratic and collaborative tradition that our country has. I'm not saying other countries don't have the technical chops necessary to be innovative. Many of them do, and they are innovative. But I think our country has the unique combination of technical innovation and the tradition to use it, the kinds of practices and information sharing and collaboration that acts to magnify the effects of innovation, and the values by which this innovation takes root and does something positive. So I think we face terrific national challenges. I'm not pessimistic in this score. I hope our political and business leadership in this country recognize that these advantages lie before us and take strong advantage of what we can do. But I frankly think there's reason to be optimistic.
We need to find ways to encourage the youth of today and tomorrow to grasp a dream and to become passionate about that dream. We saw that in the space program in the 60s and the 70s. We need to do something like that. I see it in the kids' eyes down in Texas as I work with them in cyber defense competition, but it's a small group of folks. It's not a big group. I think part of this is then going back to each of us as individuals in our own education. We have to understand the world is continuing to change around us. It is flat. It's getting flatter. I see as I work with a lot of youth, there isn't this sense of alignment necessarily that maybe we had with regards to a national security career. But there is this basic values system that Sam was talking about that we really, as parents and as teachers, as people in influence, we should be about describing not only a threat, but describing where we need to work and help each other as a nation. And I think this is a great space to do that.
You said that you believe that states are the most direct threat towards the U.S. government. And I agree, and I respectfully disagree. I think in terms of cyber espionage, you are correct. States are a great threat to the United States and the private industry within it. But I think towards cyber attacks, where you see attacks on industry or the financial industry, I think that the greater threat is non-state actors, and I'll explain why. Assuming that we're dealing with rational actors, countries are tied together because of our globalized system, and our financial systems are so closely integrated that no country, without being directly threatened, is going to want to destroy the good faith of our international financial system. But because of technologies like Bitcoin, which is an alternative payment system and currency which does not rely on the faith of a government for its value, and digital gold and systems like that, you see that a non-state rational actor can essentially attack our financial system and be insulated from the effects that go with a destruction in the financial industry. And I'm wondering if anybody can answer that. And I'm wondering, because I'm wondering, the theme of, I guess, of cyber is that you see state actors basically declining in power and a rise of non-state capabilities. And I'm wondering, how is the United States changing its policy like it did in 2002 with Bush's national security strategy document, which basically defined how they're going to deal with non-state terrorists? How is the U.S. basically creating policy to deal with these new non-state actors which are attacking our system?
I want to talk to your professor. You're going to get an A. Let me respond to that. First, there is a lot of hypothesis generation today, which is different from theory, right? Hypothesis generation is, this is an idea that could be true. Theory takes it down into, all right, we've collected information, we've analyzed it scientifically, now we know it to be true. The question of whether or not sovereignty is slipping away from states and non-state actors are gaining power is, I would say, a good, solid hypothesis. It could be true. But these are, what did somebody say about the French Revolutions? Too soon to tell? It's also too soon to tell. I mean, the rise of Facebook, what's happened in Arab Spring, the use of social media, the implementation of alternate currencies like Bitcoin, those are interesting things and they bear studying. And these phenomena are useful for generating hypotheses. I think it is too early to come up with a new theory of international relations that replaces the Westphalian system. I think it's possible to have hypotheses, that we can generate hypotheses about that, and we should, and you should, and I hope you do, and then I hope you follow it up with good research, and so that we can develop those theories. But these are early days. This has really only happened, to a certain extent, since information technology became ubiquitous, when the phone company was broken up and the regulatory structures allowed competition, and then the technology became cheap and affordable and more or less easy to use. So I think it's still relatively early days, less than 30 years since ubiquity became a component of the information technology world. Now, in terms of the big problem, I want to go back and be quite clear about what I said. I didn't say that non-state actors are not as big a problem. What I said is the problem I want to hit first right now, because there are elements of it that need to be solved more quickly. Non-state actors are a big problem, and in some cases it appears they may be getting the resources and assets and technology and expertise of state actors. But when a criminal commits a criminal act, if we can find them, which isn't always easy, but if we can, there are things we can do. There are both domestic and some international structures for law enforcement. But international structures for dealing with bad actors at the nation-state government level, I think that has yet to come. And also the stakes are really high. While the financial system can be imperiled, it's conceivable that an attack on a critical infrastructure could be existential, and that may also be a different problem. I'm not saying that this is that one problem is easier to solve or harder to solve, but I would say that the question of getting the nation-state issue under control, or at least starting to address it, is a challenge that probably needs more urgency than it's getting. And if I had to spend some hours in the day, I think that would be my center of gravity right now. Not to say that one is more important than the other.
Bob, would you like to
Yeah,
jump in?
yeah. Let me just take the discussion down just a different vein. Maybe you've thought through it yourself. In an interconnected world, we're creating greater transparency, and as we do that, states that are growing around the world also recognize that. They also have within them where they may have not, as growing powers, had a lot of infrastructure. They're building a lot of infrastructure today, which, as Sam indicated, has a lot of it's IT based, and it is interconnected. In a sense, then, when you look at states that threaten us today, my sense, I think, is that we're in this period of time where we're mutually deterred. I mean, there's kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities of nation states that would cause nation states to pause before trying to engage in something in today's space, because of the low barriers to entry and the offensive nature of cyberspace. I am concerned about this nexus between state-developed capability and the potential leakage, whether it be through security or criminal collusion or terrorist collusion, that is problematic. Not to say that the calculus couldn't change over time, but it is a real concern.
I want to thank both Bob Butler and Sam Visner. They really are extraordinary people. It's a pleasure to be with them. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And I thank very much the council, CSC, and the program, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.